finally played for my favorite part. Yes, I'm so happy.
Hey dude, controller, mouse, spacebar, or up key?
Fuck the rules, fuck the game, fuck you tools, fuck your lame. If giving a fuck means sucking up, then
Same.
fuck the fame.
Sometimes the only good thing about a controller is that spider becomes easier, and like, why even is that? Like, why is spider so much easier on controller?
I don't know.
But like everything, and like spam is a lot easier on up arrow go.
Who are borderline retarded? Yeah, fuck me for my hard words. Fuck another hard word. Fuck me for my hard work that got me into Harvard. Fuck my past. Fuck the time. Fuck it fast. If you think I'm fucking with you, then you're fucking with your fucking last. God bless you, common cold. Fuck the Pope. Fucking old. If you love the Lord, they would have sold this mansion made of solid gold. So fuck it. Yeah, fuck it. Fuck it. I said it. Fuck it. Fuck it. Gonna say no vegans, preachers, all them geezers. Fuck it. Fucking fuck the fashion scene. It is so fucking obscene. It will take a poor vaccine chick and make her turn bulimic. Fuck the shit that I came for and fuck the shit I paid for. The rappers I made a name for, calling for a race war. Now go out and pimp their rides, buy, accessorize, and turn 10,000 bright eyes to the company run by the white guys. You suck, you fucking suck, you suck so much, you suck. Drop you hit my suck as much as you, I'd motherfucking shut it up, you suck. You fucking suck it, so fucking shut it.
I just beat it! I just beat it! I just beat it! I just beat it!
I beat F.
I beat it! I beat it! I just beat it!
GG.
I just beat it! I just beat it! I just beat it!
GG,
I
man.
just beat it! I just beat it! Oh my god! Oh my god! Oh my god!